Without further ado, we're going to get started. Thanks for being with us here tonight. We are new to this webinar scene, but we're trying to get good content out to get people educated, on the market and, to just understand, what it means to be a home buyer today, a home seller, and an investor. So our goal is each month to do a webinar on, geared towards buyers, sellers, or investors. So last month, actually our first webinar 2 months ago, we did a COVID update, which everyone was curious about, right, when that was first hitting. Last month in May, we did a seller workshop. Today we're doing a buyer workshop, and likely next month we'll do something geared towards investors, how to find deals, how to rehab properties, 1031 exchanges, all that good stuff. So tonight we're going to talk about what it means to be a buyer and how to confidently purchase your first home or your fifth home, really just geared towards helping people understand how to be a successful home buyer. So just a couple of housekeeping ideas. We are going to have some polls during this webinar. We want this to be engaging. If we are just going to be, if I'm just going to be a talking head, you can go get that on YouTube. So webinar, please engage with us, answer the poll questions. We'll post the results so we can kind of see where people are at. There's going to be obviously a chat. So please pop questions in there as they come up. We'll answer them at the end, but you may forget by the end. So just pop them in there as they come up, and we'll spend a little bit of time at the end on Q&A. And then, interact with, you can wave, you can give a thumbs up if you agree, with what we're saying. So please do engage. Goal today is to empower home buyers to be confident in purchasing a perfect home, and also providing some clear takeaways on what that takes. So you look less like this and more like these happy people right here. And you go from this. I love it when people call me on a listing that's been in escrow for 2 weeks and say, can I see this property? Just because a lot of the online portals are not that up to date or high quality when it comes to having good information. That's why you need a great agent behind you. I like this one. Just got pre-qualified online. So you could say things are getting pretty serious. You get bonus points if you can pop in the chat which movie that guy's from. And this is what our clients look like when they get their offers accepted. Tina Fey, Saturday Night Live. Well, it's old school. If you would like to chat in more detail on something that we don't get into tonight, or just specific details on a property or situation, please do click on the Calendly link that's going to be posted in the chat right now. You can book a 15-minute phone call or 30-minute Zoom meeting where we can get more into the weeds with any specific scenarios. You can also sign up for our newsletter where we keep all of our clients and just Sphere of Influence updated on what's happening in the market. But every 3 to 4 weeks, we send out a market update. So again, thank you for being with us tonight. We're going to cover a little bit about the market, a little bit about how to maximize your home purchase. We're going to look at some transaction milestones. We're going to talk a little bit, just briefly, about some of our services, and then we're going to do some Q&A. So why listen to me and what I have to say? I've been selling real estate for about 11 years with Keller Williams. We've helped buyers, sellers, and investors accomplish more than $300 million in real estate sales. So we definitely have, I think, a really good system for helping buyers successfully complete a purchase. My background is actually in accounting, graduated from Pepperdine. I'm a real estate investor myself, so I put my money where my mouth is. I'm not just telling you, what you should do having not done it, but I've actually done it myself and purchased and sold over 60 properties, in the last decade. So today I get to talk about the love of my life, residential real estate, right after my wife and children, of course. So why buy a home in the first place? I think that's a relevant place to start. Why even have the conversation? I like this. It's the most able investment. How is it able? It's accessible, appreciable, rentable, improvable, deductible, stable, and livable. One of the couple unique things about real estate, I'm going to start from the bottom up. Not many assets like real estate where you can implement leverage. You can put as little as 3.5%, 5% down and control an asset that's much greater in value than you would be able to purchase for cash. Obviously, that's one of my favorite things about real estate, and that's not even mentioned here, of course, the leverage piece. Just a lot of benefits to real estate when compared to other asset classes. And I know I'm talking more about the investment side, but what better option, right? If you have to live somewhere, to be able to have an investment and something that offers you a lifestyle that is much different than that of being a renter. So we're gonna do a quick poll. And the question is, how much experience do you have with real estate? So we're going to get just a little bit of an idea of kind of who our audience is. Are you new to real estate? Do you own your first home? Have you purchased and sold many times? Or are you a real estate investor? So if you give us an answer there, and we'll go ahead and post those results to see kind of who we have here with us tonight. Give it about another 5 seconds here. All right, so we got a bit of a mix. We got some investors. We got people that have bought and sold several times. We've got some veterans with us. No, doesn't look like we have any newbies tonight. So let's look at the market and see what's happening out there. So it's been pretty unique what's happening with the inventory. I think a lot of people expected, as a result of COVID and just a lot of the chaos out there, that we would see a lot more homes on the market. Maybe people needing to sell, having to sell, a lot of forbearances out there. What's been interesting is that has not been the case, at least not yet. We're seeing very limited inventory. Pretty much a time of year when inventory would be increasing dramatically, which is really March, April, May. You know, we were delayed about a month and a half, right, because of COVID. A lot of homes came off the market, and a lot of homes did not come on the market. We started to see inventory come back, and strangely enough, this never happens at this time of year. Inventory in the last 2 weeks actually came down 2%, which again is very atypical for this time of year. Typically, we'd expect inventory to be growing and growing throughout the year, whereas at this same 2-week period, demand actually came up 24%. So what we're seeing is, between demand going up and supply going down, we're seeing a drastic impact on expected market time. So expected market time is just the average number of days it takes to sell a home as an average across, you know, in this case, broken out by different price points. And what we see is that up to about $1 million, we have a very low market time. In fact, it is now the hottest market that we've seen since June of 2013, which is just a total head scratcher given everything that's going on. But that is what it is. And in fact, up to 2 million, at the 1.5 to 2 million range is technically a balanced market. And then not until you get up over 2 million does it actually transition to a buyer's market. So pretty interesting. We all know interest rates are super low. Another record just happened. Record was set. We now have seen the lowest interest rate in history since they've recorded interest rates in the early 1970s. We just broke. We're at about 3% right now on a 30-year, and down at about 2.6, 2.7 on a 15-year. So after you deduct your mortgage interest on your taxes, I mean, it's the closest to free money that I think we're going to find. So let's talk a little bit about how to maximize your home purchase. We're going to talk about timing, pricing, and shopping. So we're going to start off with timing. When's the best time to buy? Is there a bad time? And we're going to look a little bit at market conditions. So I've got another poll question for you all, and it is, what is the best time of the year to buy a home? And if there are some of you out there watching us on Facebook Live, you can actually go to jordanbennettonline.com/buyer-workshop, and you can actually join us here on the webinar if you're having trouble figuring out how to do that. All right. All right, so we've got some winter, and we've got some spring. Nobody said summer or fall. So let's see here. Okay, we've shared those results with you. Now let's take a look. So the good news is, in Orange County, it's always a good time to buy. One of my favorite statements is, you know, my financial planner says, when is the best time to plant an oak tree? And of course, the answer is today, or even better, yesterday, last week, last month, last year, 10 years ago, 100 years ago. Of course, right? The earlier you plant it, the more it's going to grow and mature and produce fruit. And so it's the same thing with home ownership. You know, if you have a long-term plan to hold real estate for the long term, you're going to do well. It's a little different if you're looking at real estate only as an investment. We're talking about buying your second, third, fourth property. Then you kind of have to look across different asset classes, make sure you're diversified, explore all the options. But if you're looking at home ownership to live in the home, because of what rents are doing, which is always going up, and we have a really hot rental market, it is always a good time to buy a home, to put down roots and to own real estate versus renting. In fact, one of my favorite stats is that the average homeowner has a net worth that is 30 times that of the average renter. Again, that is nationwide statistic. And of course, that's your average homeowner versus your average renter. So results will vary, but I think that's very interesting to consider. So when's the best time to buy? It's generally in the fall. You want to be kind of prepping. It's basically when the market cools down a bit, families are going back to school, demand starts to fall off a little bit. That's when you want to get in. So generally you're looking kind of August, September is really ideal. And and on the contrary wise, if you were a seller, and we discussed this on our seller workshop, you want to be targeting kind of that mid-spring, late spring. And we looked at this chart, obviously listing inventory, kind of ignore this year's chart, but in a typical year, notice what you see. You see inventory peaking around July, early August, and then it starts falling off. So if you can kind of get there late summer, early fall, there's still a good amount of inventory, but there's a lot less competition. There's less people out there. People are, putting roots down, kids are back at school, and just the home buying season has, slowed down a little bit. So is there a bad time to buy? In certain markets, yes. Here, again, not really. If it's a matter of getting in or not getting in, I mean, do you wait a year to be able to time it right seasonally and then pay 3 or 4% more because we saw, another year of appreciation? That probably ends up putting you in a worse position than pulling the trigger, taking advantage of low interest rates and getting into a home versus paying somebody else's mortgage. Let's talk a little bit about market climates. And I touched on this, or I alluded to it, but effectively what you have is if your average days on market, in other words, if the average number of days to sell a home from the time it hits MLS to the time it's in escrow is 3 to 4 months, we call that a buyer's market. If it's more than 4 months, it tips into a buyer's market from a balanced market. And if it takes less than 3 months, it becomes a seller's market. And if it's less than 2 months, it's a hot seller's market, that's the kind of market we saw right up to $1 million. Once it got over $1 million, it started tipping toward maybe just a slight seller's market and even a balanced market. What does that matter? It really is a matter of who has more leverage in negotiations. If it's a buyer's market, you have more leverage as a buyer. If it's a seller's market, you have more leverage as a seller. If it's a seller's market, buyers are lining up to buy your home and you get to call the terms. And if it's a buyer's market and there's a lot of inventory, not a lot of buyers, then you're going to have more control over the negotiations as a buyer. So now we're going to talk a little bit about pricing. So our question for you, our poll question, true or false, pre-qualification and pre-approval are the same. Is that true or is that false? Maybe for some of you veterans, it might be too easy of a question. Oh, good job. Everybody got that one right. Absolutely. A pre-qualification and a pre-approval are not the same thing. So what are some of those differences? A pre-qual is basically a very light pre-approval, right? It's more of a goal-setting step versus a really strong verified offer from your lender on what you're actually going to get and what you can actually afford. So, where a pre-qual is a lot of times even just done over the phone, and it's, again, very light. Your pre-approval actually entails an underwriter looking at all your documentation and truly telling you you are approved and you can go out and shop for a home and make an offer with that pre-approval letter. Which brings us to our second poll question here in the area of pre-approving. You need a pre-approval in order to start home shopping. True or false? A couple of you are having a real dilemma on this one here. We'll give it another couple seconds. All right, well, we didn't fool anybody again. You need a pre-approval to start home shopping. Correct, that is false. Although it's not required, it has become very commonplace. It used to be, believe it or not, 15, 20 years ago, that you could actually make an offer and you had a certain number of days to actually provide a full pre-approval. Today, the standard is when you actually submit an offer, you are required to present a pre-approval letter. No listing agent will take your offer seriously without a full pre-approval letter showing that you're qualified for that loan. So in order to make an offer, yes, you need a pre-approval. In order to start shopping, looking at homes, no, most agents do not require that for you to start getting a sense of the market and looking at places. But if you want to have your finger on the trigger, ready to purchase something, you do need that pre-approval letter. So why do you need an approval? It basically sets you apart to be able to really present yourself as a real buyer to a listing agent. So what do lenders look at? There's really three things, and I just realized that the acronym here is CIA, so it's nice and easy to remember. It's your credit, your income, and your assets. So they want to know that a lender wants to know you have decent credit, generally over 620. You usually are going to get the best rate if your credit's over 760. Whether it's 761 or 800 generally is not going to make much of a difference. As long as it's over 760, you get the best rates and terms. You need to have the income qualification, and then of course you've got to have some kind of down payment. And we'll talk a little bit about each of those. So on the credit, basically if your score is subpar, there are credit repair agencies out there that take up to about 6 months, even sometimes longer, to get credit up. So it's a good thing to get started on early. It's also a great reason to start that pre-approval process early, so you make sure all your ducks are in a row when you really are ready. When it comes to income, lenders really look at your DTI. That's your debt to income ratio. They want to know that all your monthly obligations, including your mortgage, divided by your monthly gross income, are lower than 40%. Actually, lenders will let you go up to about 43% for conventional financing, and up into the 50s in some cases for FHA. So those are things to consider as you're figuring out what you qualify for. And then finally, your assets. The lender is going to look at your cash and cash equivalents. In many cases, they will include things like 401k funds when it comes to reserve calculations and things like that. So there's a number of different things they look at, but of course, you need assets if you're going to buy a home, right? And your down payment, there's all kinds of options out there. There's down payment assistance programs. Generally speaking, you're going to need somewhere between 3.5% or more of the total purchase price, plus anywhere from about 1 to 5%, depending on the loan, again, in closing costs in order to get a deal done. So what are some of the things that a lender looks at? Of course, they're going to pull credit using your social. They want proof of employment. They do a verification with your employer to make sure that you are employed there. They're going to look at your income, your tax docs, where you live, all that good stuff to make sure that you are fully pre-approved, and an underwriter is going to review all of those things. So I've got another question for you here. To qualify for a loan, I need to have all three of the lender required items in good standing: credit, income, and assets. Is that true or false? We'll give this a few more seconds. Okay, well that was pretty evenly split. Basically, some people said true, some people said false. So the answer is false, but it's a bit of a trick question. There are some niche programs. Your main programs through Freddie and Fannie, yes, you need to have good credit. You need to have the proper DTI, and you need to have a down payment. However, there are programs out there where if you have two of the three, there are options. In other words, let's say that you had good credit, you've got a down payment, but because you're an entrepreneur like me, you are a business owner, you write off a lot on taxes so that your taxable income is really low. Well, that's what the lender looks at. They look at that taxable income. Well, there are bank statement programs out there where a lender will actually look at the deposits into your bank account, and they'll count all of it as income. So basically, if you're not reporting, or you have a lot of write-offs for Uncle Sam's purposes, there are programs out there, if the income isn't there, but the credit and the assets are, that you can get a loan. Same thing if you have the income and you have the assets, but you don't have great credit. There's some hard money, portfolio lenders, and there's other options out there. So in other words, if you have two of the three between the credit, the income, and the assets, there is a loan out there. It may not be the most favorable, best terms on the market, but you can still get a loan and get into a property even if one of those is lacking. The other thing too to consider is there's ways to approach. For example, if you don't have good credit, there's credit repair. If you don't have great income, you can get a co-borrower, right? If you don't have the assets, there's down payment assistance programs. There are 401k loans. You can get a gift. So there's a lot of options, to make it work, and that's where obviously a more in-depth specific conversation would take place. So loan shopping, of course, it's your job to really find, the best deal on a loan and to look at everything in context of the whole picture. There's a lot of teaser rates on the internet, 2.6%, interest. You got to ask questions like, what are the costs associated with that rate? What are the lender fees? What are the terms? Is it an ARM product? So there's a lot of things to consider. So a lot of times some of the advertising is just based around the rate. But again, you see a lot of bait and switch online. So you got to be really careful with that. Your main loan types are your conventional, your FHA, your USDA, which are very limited here in Orange County because we don't have much in the way of rural areas, which with the exception of some of the canyon areas. And then of course the VA program for vets where you can actually put 0% down. So great question. What if I don't have enough money for a down payment? Well, I touched on that briefly already. I actually mentioned a couple that aren't here, which is a 401k loan or a gift. But there are a number of other programs out there to assist with that down payment to allow you to get into something. Again, if you don't have the down, but you have the credit and the income, there are options. How do you calculate your payment? How do you figure out what you can afford? A lot of the mortgage calculators online are tricky because you see a payment, it looks like you can buy $1 million house with a $3,000 a month payment. You're probably not looking at the whole picture. You're probably just looking at the principal and the interest. And what happens is you got to add the last three, the taxes, insurance, and association dues, right? Most communities, if they're older, are going to have about a 1% tax rate in Orange County. Some of the brand new homes that have Mellow Ruse bonds can be as high as 2%, can have a huge impact on your payment. So you really want to look at that full picture. And then of course your insurance and then your association dues if you are a part of an HOA. So we've got another poll question for you here, and it's who pays for closing costs? So the closing costs when you complete a purchase, are they paid for by the seller, the buyer? Are they split equally? Or do the seller and buyer decide who pays for what? All right, we'll give us about 3 more seconds. Okay, I'm not tricking anybody tonight. So they said, everybody said buyer and seller decide who pays for what. Yeah, that's absolutely accurate. Generally speaking, the seller does pay for more of the costs. There are a number of seller costs that are traditionally paid for by the seller. Of course, the buyer has their lender fees, which are not seller costs, but ultimately it's a negotiation. In fact, everything is negotiable in a transaction. Down to I've seen before, or I haven't seen personally, but I heard a story of somebody actually asking for a client's bird to be included in the sale. So anything's possible. It's all negotiable. There are standards in each different state and county and kind of what's the tradition. So that is really case by case, and we could go into more detail on that. We won't, but it is all negotiable. And there are all kinds of different closing costs, which again, if you have specific questions, pop it in the chat and we can touch base on it at the end. But at a high level, you've got two types of closing costs. You have what are called your recurring closing costs. Those are going to be costs that you'll see again in the future, and you're basically just prepaying through escrow. So it's not really a cost in the sense of a fee, something you don't get back. It's something you're just paying up front. For example, you're going to pay for your homeowner's insurance probably for the whole year or at least 6 months through escrow. You're going to pay probably your first 2 months of HOA dues. You're going to pay some prepaid interest, so you're not making a payment for maybe 45 days after closing. You're going to pay probably your next 6 to 12 months of taxes. Those are all called recurring costs. It's just things you're paying up front. So it actually makes your closing costs look higher than they are as far as actual costs, because they're really just things that you'd need to pay down the road that you're paying up front. And then there's a bunch of actual costs, real expenses that are associated with the transaction that you're not going to pay again. Those are called non-recurring closing costs. Things like paying your loan down or paying to get your rate lower by paying points, origination fees, service charges, etc. So what are some mistakes to avoid in escrow during the loan process so you don't screw up your loan? Don't make any large purchases. Don't change your job. Don't take out any new credit applications. Don't get too many inquiries on your credit, and don't overextend yourself. These are all things that can botch your loan midway, and then you get to the closing table and your lender says, oh, you switched jobs, you went from W-2 to 1099, and you don't have a history of being 1099, I can't do your loan. You don't want that kind of surprise, right? So make sure that you are in constant communication with your lender, and before doing anything out of the ordinary, you get the thumbs up or the golden handshake to have approval to do that. So let's talk a bit about shopping. I won't talk too much about this because I'm biased, but you got to find an agent. To do that, you want to read their reviews. You want to look at their past sales. You really want to do your homework. It's becoming more and more a social media and an online credibility world. You can't do anything these days without it being documented and people talking about it. So go online and look at what that agent's history is, so you're making sure that you're hiring the best. And then interview. I think it's amazing to me that most people will interview 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different agents when it comes to selling their house, and yet they're can be very careless on the agent they hire to represent them on the purchase. Why is the purchase important? Well, you make money when you buy it. If you buy right, regardless of what happens in the market, yes, it will affect you, right? But if you buy right and you get the right deal, that's when you make the money, right? So you want to make sure that you're interviewing and you're asking good questions to make sure that you are truly hiring the best. Next thing you want to do is narrow down your criteria. Figure out what's really important. What are your needs, wants, must-haves, must-not-haves? And you really want to go into the weeds on this and go deep and make sure that you're determining, is this a stepping stone? Is this a 10-year plan, a 20-year plan, a 3-year plan? You really want to kind of have a big picture in mind, so you're not putting yourself in a position where you're going to have to sell in 2 years and buy again because you didn't think long-term enough. You also want to avoid the HGTV effect. That means being swayed by stuff that looks pretty and not considering the major, functional and structural elements of the home. You also want to set realistic expectations within your budget. Most people start here. Expectations are here, and market is here. Or in other words, budget is here, market is here. There's always some kind of disconnect. So most people have to make a decision and say, hey, to get what I want, I either am going to have to increase my budget or slightly lower my expectations to meet my budget, right? It's very rare that I have a super realistic client right out of the gate that says, I'm willing to pay for exactly where the market's at. Unless, of course, it's a client coming from the Bay Area, which is about the only clients we work with that say, wow, your real estate's such a good deal here in Orange County. Most people have sticker shock, right? If you're coming from Montana or Ohio or Texas or most any other place in the country except maybe the Bay Area or New York. Showings, you're going to go look at homes. Right now, because of COVID, open houses are still restricted. I am not sure if it's going to be weeks or months before we see them come back. So right now, all showings are happening by private tour, in many cases with masks and gloves where necessary. But private tours are how you're going to go and look at homes. So what to look for? What are the most important things in finding a home? You want to focus on the things that you cannot change. In other words, you want good bones, a functional floor plan. You want outdoor space. Lot size is one of the most underrated things that buyers consider in Orange County. Our land here is so expensive, and yet oftentimes you'll have a home that actually has a significantly larger lot that doesn't necessarily have a tremendous premium on it. So lot and backyard are really important. Location, of course, we've all heard location, location, location. Value adds like a pool, view, HOA amenities. It's interesting that even though you could easily spend $70,000 to $100,000 on putting a pool in, you don't necessarily get that back out. In other words, 2 houses side by side, model match, same house, one has a pool. That house might get 30 or 40,000 extra, but they're not going to get 100,000 extra. So in other words, if you want a pool, you're better off buying a house with a pool than building one. How about showings of what to look for? So we talked about what good things to look for. What red flags do we want to look for? We want to look at things that would imply there is significant movement in the foundation, cracks in the walls. We want to look for signs of water damage, mold, mildew, weathered roofs, bad odors, animal smoke, sewer, signs of neglect or deferred maintenance. What's so interesting is that buyers are so focused on, is it pretty? If it's pretty, I'm going to buy it. Well, the reality is it could be pretty, and all of the things that are pretty could be really superficial. And some of the most expensive things are not the things that make the house look pretty. They're the things like the major systems, your electrical, your plumbing, your structure, your roof, and your HVAC. So you want to pay attention to those things when you're doing a walkthrough. Most people don't. And I think it's really important to know that those things should be considered on the front end. So let's give a brief look at what a transaction looks like and how to navigate those milestones so you can have the smoothest possible closing. So we talked already and kind of beat that horse with the pre-approval and what that looks like. We talked a little bit about shopping and home tours, hiring an agent, narrowing the criteria, doing showings, and then making offers. Let's look a little bit at the escrow process. So this is where you're kicking the tires. Typically what happens is when you open escrow, you're going to put a deposit in escrow, and then you're going to begin to do your due diligence. You're going to make sure, do I still really want this house after I find out, what's behind the walls and what's under the rug? So you're going to do an inspection. This is where a home inspector is going to go through that house with a fine-tooth comb and tell you everything that's going on there. You're going to get an appraisal. This is where your lender is going to make sure you're not overpaying for the home. Usually the lender's got more skin in the game than you do as a buyer. Most people aren't putting down 50% or more. They're putting down 3, 5, 10, 20%. So the lender has a lot of skin in the game. They want to make sure you're not overpaying. This is your safety valve to make sure you're not overpaying, because that lender is going to do that third-party independent appraisal to validate the price of that house. Disclosures is where the seller is going to tell you anything they know about that home. And that's required that they disclose everything that they know or that they should know about that house. You're going to review HOA documents. If the home's in an association, you want to make sure there's no funky rules, that the HOA is not underwater from an expense perspective, that there's no special assessments coming. And then you're going to do negotiations. Once you've figured out all the information, now you're going to go back and negotiate with the seller. Was there any appraisal issues? Were there any big surprises on that inspection? Did they disclose something that you didn't know that's significant before you made the offer? You want to do that negotiation after you have all that information. During this time, at the same time, your loan is going through that approval process. Once your loan is approved and the negotiations are complete, you're going to fully remove all of your contingencies. In other words, you're telling the seller, I'm good, I've done my homework on the property, and I'm moving forward. It's at this point that your deposit, which has been in escrow all this time, is now at risk. If you cancel after removing your contingencies, the seller could theoretically keep your deposit. So that's important to understand. So we talked a little bit about how your inspector is going to come in. Your appraisal is going to make sure that your value is there. Your disclosures are going to identify any defects or malfunctions. Your HOA docs are going to show you the CC&Rs, the rules and regs, the board minutes, and the financials. And then your negotiations are going to make sure that you're getting the best deal and that nothing gets missed before you remove all those contingencies and your loan is fully approved. One of the things I always tell my clients is you don't break out the champagne when you get your offer accepted. It's a nice milestone, it's exciting, but it's once you've done all your due diligence and you've removed your contingencies, that's when you call the movers, you break out the champagne, you give notice, that's when you know it's a done deal. And then finally you get to closing. So once you've removed those contingencies, now it's a race to the finish line. So you're going to get from your lender something called a clear to close. Then they're going to send out what's called a closing disclosure with all the numbers and costs and just spelling everything out for you. The closing disclosure starts a 72-hour clock where you actually have to review that disclosure for 3 days before you can sign your loan documents. Your loan documents are going to be signed. You're going to wire your closing funds to escrow. One question I get very often is, when do I need my down payment? You actually are not sending the money to escrow until usually the day before or on the day of closing. So those funds aren't actually going to escrow until really almost at the finish line. Finally, you're going to get the lender. This is really on the lender side. They're going to review final funding conditions, and then the loan is going to fund. It's going to record, which means title is moving title over to the new owner, and then you're going to get keys to your new home. So that is the process of buying a home in a nutshell. Let's look really briefly at the good, the bad, and the ugly. The ugly, not completing your prep work, not getting your ducks in a row on the front end, ending up with a bad loan because you had bad credit, buying a home you don't like out of desperation or bad timing, or not finding one at all. What's the bad? Having analysis paralysis from not using sound purchasing strategies or ending up with buyer's remorse. I'll tell you what, one of the biggest, I don't want to say it's my own regret, I think it's the regret I see in others, is when people try and time the market and they procrastinate and they procrastinate and they don't just pull the trigger on getting into property. I remember still to this day, I had clients back in 2015, 16, 17, thinking, hey, the market's been running up for 3, 4, 5 years. It's a bubble. It's going to fall. Guess what? It's come up probably about another 30 to 40% since then. So the amount of money left on the table by not getting into home ownership, to me, is crazy. So what's the good? What does the good look like? Nailing your pre-approval, getting your ducks in a row on the front end, standing out amongst the competition, closing on a home you love, getting a great deal, and finding something you can really stay in for the long term. So if you're ready to buy or you're thinking about investment property, getting into your first purchase, if you have additional questions, I'd love to help, love to answer any questions that you have. Like I mentioned, click that Calendly link in the chat box, and I'd love to set up either a call or a Zoom meeting with you to get more in depth. And we're going to do a little bit of Q&A here before we wrap up. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. And thank you for the heads up about not seeing my presentation on the front end. I apologize. Why fall versus winter? As far as when is it a good time to sell? I had said the fall is a better time. You know, I think what happens by the time you get to the end of the year, inventory is so nominal, inventory is so tight that even though demand and supply move pretty close hand in hand, I think that by the end of the year, there's just really not a whole lot to choose from. And so depending on how picky you are, it can be difficult to find a home in the winter. What I find with the late summer, early fall is that there's still a decent amount of inventory. There's still those homeowners that haven't sold yet. They're kind of holding on to hope that maybe there's still a buyer out there. And yet the demand has started to come down pretty significantly. I think between summer vacations, kids going back to school, just that season of being really active on the demand side, it slows down. So I'm really an advocate that if you're thinking about buying, kind of that August, September, October it can be pretty ideal. Another question we have here, in a buyer's or a seller's market, is it better to try and upgrade your home? In other words, getting into a specific neighborhood, but need to sell current home for down payment? I'm having a bit of a hard time understanding that question. So is it better to try and upgrade your home if you can't, basically if you can't find the right home? I mean, I would say the most financially conservative decision is, yes, it's always going to be to stay where you are, because the reality is when you're not selling, you know, you're not giving up any equity, right, in the sale. And obviously you're not moving into something that's more expensive, so it's more conservative. I mean, you know, buying a bigger, better home isn't always the best financial decision. It's usually a lifestyle decision, right? Not everybody makes decisions based, if people only made decisions based on what's most financially prudent, there would be no Gucci purses, there would be no Louis Vuitton purses, and there would be no fancy cars, right? But we don't make decisions just based on the financial implications. We do tend to make decisions based on kind of the meeting of the two, right? The financial, does it make sense? Can I justify it? And then that emotional lifestyle, really what I want for my life. Another great question here, what is the cost benefit of paying points? So this is really a question of if you have a long-term or a short-term approach to that house. In other words, if you are not going to be in that house for very long, maybe 3 or 4 years, it probably does not make sense to pay points to get a lower interest rate, because you're probably going to pay more than you save over that following 2, 3, 4 years. Now, the opposite is true. If you plan on buying a home that you're going to live in for 20 years, you're literally buying your forever home, or a 20-year home. it could absolutely make sense to pay points because your payback period might be 3 or 4 years, and then after that, you're in the black. So what most lenders will do, what I've even helped clients do, is figure out what's the cost of buying down that rate, and then what's the payback period. In other words, if it takes 2 years to get paid back, in other words, it takes you 2 years to get the amount of savings to justify having paid the points, that could make a lot of sense. If it takes 8 years to get paid back for what you paid to get the lower payment, it might not make sense. It's really a payback question, and which I know is a bit convoluted of an answer, but it's something that I could definitely work out with you and kind of look at that specific scenario for you. Another question we have here, can I get my earnest money back if I decide not to buy? That's a great question. I would say that is, of all the concerns that buyers have, I would say that's the number one concern. Most buyers that are writing a check for 10, 15, 20, 30, $50,000 to escrow are wondering, what the heck happens to my money if something goes wrong? Well, the great thing about your contingency period in California, you've got this tire kicking period where your deposit is protected, so that if you cancel within your contingency period, you do get your deposit back and it is not at risk. And then another question we have here is, since the demand is so high, should I make an offer sight unseen to get a leg up? That is something that I have seen buyers do, where you're actually putting an offer on a property without even seeing it to tie it up, and then doing your inspection and going in and looking at it. Now, a lot of listing agents, in the industry, we call that a blind offer. A lot of listing agents won't accept blind offers because they don't want to get into escrow with somebody that very likely could back out. So it's a bit more of a nuanced question, but yes, you can make an offer without actually seeing a home. And then another question here, does my type of financing affect the strength of my offer? Yeah, that's a great question. It absolutely does. Listing agents like to see higher down. They love cash. Why would a cash offer be favored over a financed offer? Mostly because there's no loan to contend with. There's no appraisal. There's no chance of the buyer not qualifying. It's really just much more open and shut. So oftentimes, if you have a higher down or if you're a cash buyer, you can sometimes negotiate a slightly better price if it's apples to apples. In other words, I may see a seller take a cash offer or a higher down offer that's $3,000 or $5,000 or $8,000 less than another offer on the table. Likely, if the offer on the table, that's the lower financing, the lower down is $15,000 higher, they'll probably take that offer because it's enough of a buffer that it just makes sense to roll the dice and take the higher offer. All right, we'll do one more question here. What happens if the house appraises under the offer price? That's a great question. So I said earlier that your appraisal is like your safety valve. If you're offering $800,000 on a house and it appraises at 770, you've got a way out of the deal. Now, I'll tell you, when that happens, it's kind of like I said early on, everything's negotiable. If an appraisal comes in low, it's really back to the negotiating table. The seller does not have to lower the price to the appraised value. The buyer does not have to pay the difference and pay the higher purchase price. So normally what happens is it's a meeting of the two, and it's some kind of meeting in the middle. Depending on how hot the market is, what the specific situation was, if they had multiple offers, typically there'll be some kind of negotiation where maybe the buyer comes up a little bit over the appraised value, closer to their purchase price, and maybe the seller comes down a little bit to still make the deal happen. All right. Well, I think that's about all the questions we have for tonight. Want to thank everybody for being with us tonight. Hopefully something was gleaned. And again, if you've got any specific follow-up or more in-depth questions, please go ahead and click the Calendly link in the chat and set up a meeting. You can also Facebook, email, or text me. I'm going to go ahead and put my cell phone here in the chat. And then finally, if you are not on our email list already and getting our market updates every 3 to 4 weeks, please go ahead, hop on our website, jordanbennettonline.com, and you can sign up for our website right there on the right side of the page. All right, everyone, have a great evening. Make it a great weekend. And one last thing here. Thank you, Courtney, for just posting that. Please fill out the survey by clicking in the chat there. And definitely appreciate you being with us. Take care.